Hello and welcome to another episode of the BetaKit Podcast. I'm Douglas Saltis, Editor-in-Chief of BetaKit, and my co-host, as always, is Rob Kennedy. Somehow, we find ourselves smack dab in the middle of summer. Now, back in the day, that would have meant eagerly securing a startup train ticket for Startupfest, which I've often described on this podcast as summer camp for Canadian tech. Canadians haven't really had that luxury over the past 2 years, but while there's no startup train this year, important note to my fellow Ontarians to book your travel accordingly, Startupfest is back IRL in a big way this year with lots of changes. And I'm just not talking about a new/old venue. As you'll hear from Olivia and Alistair and the Startupfest team on this episode, Startupfest kind of used the pandemic as an opportunity to deconstruct what people wanted from a tech festival, or at least what they wanted from Startupfest. The hypothesis in 2022, meeting people isn't easy, and Startupfest is about meeting people. The solution? A shit ton of data, some interesting assumptions on human behavior, a wholly new tech stack, and a live beta test during the festival. I guess the festival is the live beta test. So what does the new Startupfest product look like, and why do we spend half of this podcast trying to describe it in video game terms? Let's dig in. Alistair, we talked earlier this week, I can't believe it, and you were walking me through some of the changes, what 2022 Startupfest looks like. Do you want to maybe start us off there? And even before that, the process of investigating how you decided what Startupfest 2022 was going to look like? Because it seems like you've made radical changes.
Yeah, it's been a few changes. So yeah, it's great to see you, Doug. Thanks for having us back. As you probably know, Startupfest has been around for quite a while. We are like Canada's original startup conference, and it had been an amazing few years. We took over entire islands. We created our own fleet of boats to get people to them. We did pitch contests that began in freight elevators, and we actually, I think, have the dubious honor of having broken an elevator in the Eiffel Tower in a pitch contest. So we've, pushed the envelope on weird stuff from grandmother judges to...
It's the most fun you can have in Montreal during the daytime.
And sometimes nighttime. And I think the key there is that Phil Tellio, the founder of the conference, has always wanted to get people out of their comfort zone safely, because that's when you're open to new experiences, which is huge. In 2020, we spent a lot of time learning how to move everything online. And I think we did that better than most. We also run a conference called Forward 50, which has become the world's biggest digital government conference. And along with Olivia, who's on the call with us. Hi, Olivia.
Hi.
Spent a lot of time looking at the tech solutions that are out there. We looked at 240 different pieces of software, talked to about 40 of the founders. And then after we ran Forward 50 in 2020, we wound up helping a lot of other organizations, Burning Man, the federal government, even a certain administration in a country to the south of us asked for help with their inauguration day, but they stopped calling on January 6th.
I wonder why.
But we, no idea.
Guatemala?
But,
We should form a committee to uncover
absolutely.
why they stopped contacting you after January 6th.
So we learned a lot, and in 2020 we really decided it was a good idea to help others, because it wasn't like a year to keep that stuff to yourself, but we kind of became the one-eyed person in the land of the blind about running virtual events. And the risk with that is that you get really comfortable, and everybody's really fatigued about rectangles. So what we decided to do was we would program this year as the unwebinar. We're all so sick of webinars that we just wanted something where we did the opposite of the abundant but disengaged content that we see online.
So what does that sounds great, because you said off the top it's nice to see you, but really this is the first time that we've just been digitally projecting our faces at each other in a couple of years. We actually had a phone call. You inspired me to walk around my neighborhood to talk to you on the phone just to get my my butt moving. What is that, especially for a festival like Startupfest, which is truly a festival, which I think most people see as a connection hub and an experience more so than stage presence. How do you functionally break that down? Because I think when you were talking about it before, you were talking about how much you're limiting the content as like a value proposition.
For sure, which is kind of the opposite of what you usually expect. So
for conferences, I think startups are like, look at all the features we've cut. That's the smart way of doing it. And maybe, you might have written a book.
We haven't actually cut the features, which is why Olivia is with us, because she's been very busy. But what we decided to do was, we still have great talks. We have, I joke that we have 6 keynotes, but we also have a whole BDC Women in Tech stage. And we have, one of the things that we did was we invited back many of our celebrity kind of speakers from past years. And these are like, founders of big household names, multiple time serial entrepreneurs, and we're making them mentors. We are quite literally giving them cards that are dance cards. So when they're networking and they meet a startup they want to meet and go and have a conversation with, they can invite them to a picnic lunch, or they can go on a walk with them and things like that. One of the things that I think startup conferences do a disservice to founders is they tend to put the celebrity on stage. And that celebrity is fun to listen to and great to tell your family about when you get home. But they can't really teach you that much, because we're all mortals. We don't have millions of dollars to our name and millions of followers. And so we wanted to let founders connect one-on-one with some of the past stars that we've had on the main stage, but as mentors one-on-one. So we've got like 20 or 30 people flying in from all over the world who are subject matter experts who've built and sold companies several times, who will be willing to sit down and have that 5 or 10 minute conversation that can really change the course of the startup.
So, and here's maybe where we get into that all of this sounds great. And I've actually, in prior years, I don't know why I was asked, but I was happy to sign up and be one of those connector mentors in Startup Fest Pass. And I would say that the experience was about what you would expect for the software at the time to function in that way, particularly when it's being stress tested by thousands of people who are in a real physical place at the same time. So how are in rolling back the focus from see the celebrities on the stage to meet the celebrities, the key people you want to like amongst the festival, how are you managing that so that it doesn't suck, I guess would be the bluntest way to put it.
So this is where the magic happens. We bit off a lot of stuff. We decided to do something we call circular matchmaking. So we really tried a new approach. The theme this year was fresh starts, because we all need a fresh start. And we realized that people's muscles for networking have kind of atrophied. And so we are doing a lot of activations that are sort of interaction that will provoke people to get out and network with others in comfortable ways. And Olivia has built many of these. So I'll let her describe some of them in a second. But one of the key things is that when you register for Startup Fest, you tell us why you're coming, and you tell us about yourself, what your role is in the organization. You're the hacker, the hustler, you're an investor or an advisor. What do you want to get out of this? What vertical are you in? What level of funding are you looking for? What your expertise is and that kind of stuff. And then we find 5 people based on a pretty sophisticated algorithm who are going to be people we think you'll find interesting, and we're going to connect you with those. We also have QR codes scattered around the place. We have a bunch of different things that are going to make it easier for you to get out of your comfort zone and talk to strangers. But the person who's built all this and knows it way better than me is Olivia, so I want to hand things over to her for a bit.
Yeah, Olivia, help us break down these complicated algorithms, which seem...
What's the machine learning algorithm that you've AI'd into
How are you identifying me through my TikTok behavior to help match me? Because because the context here is like, jokes aside, the reason why this podcast exists is because Rob and I met up at Startup Fest in like 2015 or 2016, got absolutely loaded, and we're like, you know what's cool? Podcasts.
I was doing my show at Startup Fest. Rebecca was nice enough to let me do my original show at Startup Fest, and Douglas is like, podcast, let's talk podcast. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the serendipity you want.
Serendipity is such a key word for the algorithm, and I'll explain why. But so I'll start with the circular matchmaking. So I believe it was Alistair and Rebecca who had the idea, if I'm not mistaken. So I have to give them credit at least for that. But with it sticking within the theme of, meeting new people, a fresh start, we had to put together a system for that to work. And so this was not easy. So I don't know if you've ever looked at or even have a clue of what matchmaking entails from like an algorithm and software perspective, but it is seriously complicated. Luckily, Alistair had a very kind friend who happens to be a brain, who basically coded it for us. But before we got there, it was crucial to kind of lay out the groundwork to figure out how exactly the code is going to be written out as if it was done, in person. So I had spent, I think, three weeks-ish just kind of writing a pseudocode of, okay, this person, if they want it, if they have this vertical and if they have this level of funding or they're searching for this level of funding and they're a designer, how am I going to allow the software, the steps to bring me to a point where, okay, I have to match you with an investor of that same vertical and who is providing the funding at that stage. So I think I have, I don't know how many lines of pseudocode written out, like literally word for word of like, take, like this information in Excel and then filter the file to show me this. And then with this, you copy paste. Anyways, long story short,
scenario planning essentially of like hypotheticals of engagement stuff?
Basically, so if you had a raw data file that was exported from your registration platform, that raw data has to be manipulated in some way. So that involves cleaning the data to make sure you have something that's makes sense, and then afterwards running through literally like a playbook, like step by step. Okay, how do you transform this data to a point where I could give you a sufficient match that is deemed adequate enough for matchmaking. We did construct or put into place some golden rules, let's say. So certain people had to be matched with other people, or language was a big issue. So if you're an English speaker and someone else is a French speaker, you cannot be matched because they had language preferences. There were other things like if you're a mentor or if you're a speaker, we assume that on site you'd be pretty busy already, so they're not included in matchmaking. So it's really a bunch of filters that we had to apply to this data to clean it up, and then subsequently add rules to it so that you come up with 5 matches.
And we came up with all these terms like starvation or serendipity. We kind of wound up making it like, this is one of those things that when we started looking into it, that's easy. And it turns out that the Nobel Prize in Mathematics in 2012 was awarded to solving a similar problem. So do you want to maybe explain starvation? Because I found that was like, it's not as simple as person A meets B and B meets A. The idea of circular matchmaking is that I might have Doug as someone to meet, but Doug might have Rob as someone to meet, and Rob might have Olivia as someone to meet. And so you're looking for 5 people you're supposed to track down. And we'll talk about how we find that, how you find those people. Meanwhile, people are coming to get you, right?
So I'll take it back, just like the pseudocode. Once that's done, we run it through an algorithm. So the developer essentially had the blueprint in order to create this. And then afterwards, it was just iterations upon iterations of testing that algorithm with fake data in the first place. So Alistair had constructed just like 1,000 attendees that were completely fake, running that through the algorithm, seeing what the results are visually. So this was kind of tedious because we did it manually. There was someone that was visually looking at the data and comparing to make sure it makes sense. We even gave the data to Phil, and we asked him, Phil, the founder, we asked him, does this make sense? And he'd be like, oh no, this person, I know who this is. This person could not be matched with this person, or this person's a great match for this other one. Getting his feedback, getting feedback from other team members that were at Startupfest in the past and had a gauge of what kind of interactions people were looking for, or repeat attendees. So some attendees come back year after year, and so they have a good idea of what these attendees are looking for. So after all those feedback cycles, we basically tweak these, I don't know how to explain them, these like weights or these constants, if you will, that are part of the algorithm to get that perfect in quotations, that good match for a singular person. So everything within the algorithm is based on a point system. So basically, if your vertical matches someone else's vertical, that's like max points. If your funding does not match an investor's funding stage, it'd be worth less points. So everything is really on a point and scoring system. And so the algorithm does that calculation for us and then spits out basically a bunch of values that connects
So,
people.
I have a question about the algorithmic nature of this, but you want to just quickly explain what Alistair was talking about with respect to starvation, which I imagine is a vector. No, that's cool. That's cool. It's like that's clearly a vector or a parameter, a dimension that you're matching on or thinking about. What does that mean? Hungry people meet people with food is how I take it. I'm assuming that's what
classic festival scenario.
Yeah. So once the algorithm runs through the set of rules that we've laid out for it, evidently down the line, there's going to be a time within every data set where the algorithm can no longer find matches for you that fit your criteria. So in the reg forms, we've asked people to identify their top reasons for coming to Startupfest. Some of them could be get investment. Some of them could be network with my peers or meet ecosystem partners. There's going to come a point within the data set when the algorithm is running where the algorithm can no longer find you matches that connect you to your top reason or that satisfy really those conditions that we put in place.
Is Douglas the base case? Is that what you're trying to say? Everyone just goes to Douglas? You don't look like you belong here. Talk to Douglas.
Or the opposite. Am I...
Yeah, Doug
Everyone
you have
wants to talk to
714 matches, I'm afraid.
So that's when starvation comes into play. It basically means the algorithm no longer has, according to the rules we set out, a specific person that it could associate you with or match you with. So what we did is we created a serendipity algorithm where it basically runs through a couple of parameters and matches you again on a scoring system based on these more general parameters. So serendipity is not necessarily random. There is an order to all that madness, but it is more random than the original rules we put in place when the first pass of the algorithm was run.
So you're saying that Phil gave you the power to play God with Startupfest?
Basically.
Can I tell you who I'd like to meet?
Yeah.
Anybody with the name Cobrenity, I want to meet. Okay, so let's go down that for a second because having I'm old. I've been to a bunch of tech conferences before, notwithstanding Alistair's conferences, just generically in the universe. There seems to be, from a networking perspective, there's there are these large conferences, very large conferences that have white labeled apps that you tend to get spammed on, right?
May have experienced that last week at a Toronto event.
No comment, Your Honor. So there's that kind of these just unwashed masses, huge amounts of people. Then there's things I remember for a while. Brella was really sexy. It was Brella was pretty cool. It seemed to do a good job of saying, I want to meet at this table and whatever. It still required you to take action as a human being and look through the 10,000 attendees and figure out who you wanted. This sounds like it's pretty curated, like a dating app in a sense. Are you nervous about the fact that you're okay, we're engineering this whole thing? If you get a variable wrong, I get that you're testing it. Are you worried that you're how do you account for, how do you think about that if you're are you worried about over engineering the whole thing, I guess is my question.
I mean, there's always a little bit of worry because you want essentially people to find others that they can relate to. At the end of the day, though, this is completely in the attendee's hand, and so they could go as far as they want with this. So really what we're providing, all the attendees on site will get a match sheet that's very analog, which kind of goes with our other theme, which is the unwebinar, right? So we're trying to make it less digital, not more digital. Everyone will get a physical piece of paper with their list of matches on it, and then it's up to them to really take initiative and go find those people.
Basically, what you're saying is that you've spent many, many weeks developing a super algorithm to play God, to provide attendees the best possible dance card in person they could ever receive.
Actual dance card.
Upon when they show up.
Yeah, and there's one more thing here, which is, as Olivia was saying, it's very analog. We didn't want this to be there's a thing in your inbox you didn't look at. Yeah. So when you get to Startupfest, on your badge, it will say your cubby, your message board space is C12. Hey, Doug, you're C12. You should talk to Olivia. She's in D14. You should talk to Rob. He's in J7.
Bathroom, yeah.
And he's in the bathroom. And you can put Post-it notes on their board saying, hey, come find me. Or you can ask someone, hey, do you know Olivia? I'm supposed to go talk to her or whatever. But you now have 3 days to basically find those people that we've pre-filtered as likely to be good conversations. In addition to you finding people, there are people trying to find you. But from a human perspective, this normalizes the idea that you're going to talk to people and they're going to talk to you. And we think our muscles for networking have atrophied so badly that just giving people this nudge, and it's entirely up to you. You may have an investor who's hard to get to because it's still a startup thing. You still have to hustle, but it's not as formal as please sit at this table at 12:45 and someone ghosts you and you don't meet them. And it's not as spammy and unstructured as like message me if you want to talk. This is, here's some people we think you're going to enjoy. We're not going to tell you why. We have a whole set of rules. Like when Olivia runs her algorithm, it actually spits out this match was made because you've said you're looking for team members or you want to meet other people like you. So one of the questions we ask is, what is your role in the startup ecosystem? And there's this we think there are 6 fundamental roles. There's the hacker who builds things. The hustler who promotes them and tries to get marketing done, the designer who handles every part of the interface between the human and the customer, or between the business and the customer, the analyst who does all the math and keeps everyone honest. And then there's also investors, which might be accelerators or investors. And there's advisors who are service providers, mentors, accountants, and so on. People tell us they're one of those. And so if I said, hey, I would like to meet people, we can say, well, we think we found someone else who's in the same vertical as you, has a similar business model. They're a marketplace business model. They're also a hacker. We think you're going to have a great conversation. And you go to that person, you're like, wow, well, we're already both trying to run a marketplace in the healthcare space. That's probably a great conversation, right? But we're not telling you that. You got to go find out why. And then the other thing we're doing is we're giving you topics for conversation. And so Olivia's been building this stack for our event platform and has already launched 2 new products in that. You want to talk about the what's up in the QR codes or the Convo codes?
There's a QR code basically on the walls. There's going to be little cubes that have QR codes on them scattered around the venue. You could scan any one of these QR codes and it'll basically give you a set of questions that you could ask people at the event as conversation starters. So some of them are birds of a feather conversations. So if there's 2 hackers talking to each other, they scan the hacker QR code, they'll get a list of questions all about how to build products. Or there's another version where it's mostly challenge questions. So there'll be, let's say, a topic on team. Those questions could be anything like, how do you build a good team? How do you find good teammates? What's the hiring process? So they're all designed essentially to cultivate conversations amongst people, so there never really is a point where it could be awkward.
Hey CTOs, are you endlessly building your app or website, leaving you barely any time to focus on cloud adoption? Not quite ready to hire a full-time employee to handle it either? Why not partner with Duca, an independent Canadian cloud consulting company? With pay-as-you-go pricing, Duca's AWS experts provide you with the best approach to cloud adoption and respond quickly to your needs so your business runs smooth. Keep your head out of the cloud and focus on your business by booking your free discovery call at duca.ca. That's DIUCA.ca. I'm interested in what data that you have to have created these kind of like categories or these levers. I think having someone like Phil, who's been running this festival for years, who's deeply sourced in the ecosystem, is a great hype check against bad scenario outcomes that you want to move against. But I have to go back to just even the matching component initially, and your huge hypothesis on outcomes, because there's one good matchmaking process that everyone agrees works. It's ELO ranking for chess. And then there's everything else. But predominantly, like the most common one that people experience, if we're not talking about like Tinder and Bumble, is matchmaking in video games, which is fraught, everyone hates, and needs to be constantly iterated upon post-launch to get to something reasonable, because good players, the higher tier people, only want to be amongst themselves and don't want to be bothered. And lower tier players either want the opportunity to be in the higher tier or to not be crushed by them, or there's so many divergent outcomes among that stratification. You don't have the opportunity to patch this thing. You have a 3-day festival. So how are you approaching, like, is the QR code questions and like, I guess the socialization approach that you're taking, not a hedge, but a counterbalance to like what's going to be 3 days of like open beta testing for your
Doug,
algorithm?
You're kind of assuming that someone's going to like immediately do a headshot when they try and talk to an investor they're not worthy of. Like, I'm raising seed and this person does Series C. That's the
I've seen
equivalent of a
it.
headshot.
I've seen it at Startupfest. I've seen people hug each other and cry securing funding at Startupfest.
There could be awkward conversations. We cannot take the jungle out of the startup process. There is an element of natural selection. If there's a desirable VC that we've said you should go to, and we keep talking about fundraising, but there's actually a lot more than this. There's like, maybe you want to join an accelerator. I think we have like 18 things that you might want to get out of Startupfest, and they vary. If you're an advisor, maybe you're looking for a board seat. So there's enough, to put it another way, to use a video game analogy, there's more than just tanks. There's healers, there's engineers, there's lots of different roles. There's lots of different tasks. Take the base, kill as many victims as possible, that kind of stuff, right? In our analogy, there's lots of different roles, lots of different tasks. We're giving you the opportunity to have conversations that are meaningful. You'll notice there's a little timer in there. So it's like, okay, we're done now. It's time to move on. Like, there's a convenient, okay, I need to exit stage left politely. But the important thing I think to remember is that we're leaving a lot in the hands of the human experience. We are normalizing talking to strangers. We are feeding them topics that might be interesting. And then we are getting the hell out of the way. You may not be able to find a person, but I can put a note on your cubby at Startupfest, and then other people can come by, pick it up, and go, oh, I got 3 people who've sent me notes. Maybe I'm going to reach out to them. You may never meet the 5 people we tell you to go find. Maybe you're bad at networking. Maybe you're a bad hustler. That's probably a strong predictor of your success as a viable startup. Okay, we're not going to get in the way of that process, right? So you're absolutely right. Now, I talked to a data scientist at Blizzard who told me that the reason they match inadequately is because when they match accurately, they get high churn. And so they actually have data models that predict when someone's about to quit the PvP battles and battleground and stuff and let them win. And that pisses off the other person.
Stomps on somebody, but they'll stick around for a couple days.
That upsets them, but it means they renew their subscription. So there are other factors at play in those matchmaking scenarios that infuriate players. I think in our case, everybody in the ecosystem recognizes that there is a certain amount of wasted effort talking to startups you'd never invest in, pitching a VC you're not ready for, prematurely explaining your product or going into too much detail about it rather than giving the tips of the waves. Yeah, there's tons of ways to die on the battlefield. Our whole goal here was to create something that causes you to find people you will more likely to have a good conversation with. So even if you're not in the same segment, but maybe you both have a love of transactional e-commerce sites or subscription-based businesses. Okay, the two of you can talk about your experience with churn and customer lifetime. Maybe you're not going to invest, but at least you had something. And because you know there's going to be something, you're more likely to kind of go in with an open mind and see what you have to learn, we think. But I think I'm going to challenge you a little more. Doug, you talk about leaderboards. Olivia, you play a lot of co-op games, cooperative cooking games, right? How do you feel this
We're
is
just
like,
all outing ourselves
is this
as gamers
headshot
here.
sniping or is this collaborative cooperative stuff, Olivia?
Well, that's a good question.
Before we all out each other in which games do we play, and I'll know that I usually play the healer in the competitive games. But I think that speaks to the different intentions coming into this.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering is like, what went behind the decision to invest so much in time and energy into this relative to other conferences and festivals when they know that connection is going to be a major component of their event and they just provide wide spaces and food trucks and let them do it. This seems to, the energy and the intention, the effort here, which we're interrogating because it's incredibly interesting, I think is a reflection of the fact that Startup Fest has made a conscious decision to like roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty with this stuff, which is a pretty big bet relative to saying
you didn't need to do it.
Hey, the beanbag chairs are back and we're pretty sure there's not going to be a monsoon this year. Have at it. So what goes into that thought process of even in like deciding to wade into this, to have maybe some of that blowback or the not renewed subscriptions because someone did want to snipe someone's head off or be the support person, and they were maybe guided to an experience that they, if not weren't interested in, maybe they're just like, why is Startup Fest focusing on this versus name the other things that other conferences do? It's like it's a big weighted bet. So I just want to understand better the
other conferences are phoning it in. This is one of the things we did. We also have spectacular speakers. We have and we, as you probably know, we don't tend to go for the easy speaker, the like household name celebrity with not a lot to share. We have a woman speaking this year who can legitimately claim to have invented both the audiobook and the ebook. Nobody knows her. She's amazing. She's like the chief of innovation at Hachette. I met her at South by on the lawn at the Four Seasons. We had the most amazing conversation I've had with a tech founder in ages. She's got these incredible stories about working with big organizations. She's going to talk about how do you go to that big corporate and get a partnership, and also her struggles building new technology and what weak signals she sees and what it looks like. So I would say, just because we're doing a lot on this doesn't mean we're not doing the other stuff. We have a whole bunch. One of the things we realized is that we learned a lot of things in the pandemic that were useful in the virtual world, and we shouldn't throw that baby out with the bathwater. So matchmaking and breakout rooms were pretty awesome when done right. The fact that you could have a one-on-one sidebar chat, the fact that you could poll people and get feedback, and we are bringing many of those into the physical world. So we've taken the stuff that didn't suck, the baby of the pandemic, and brought it into the real world. We're heavily relying on a software tool called Mentimeter, which allows a lot of interactions. We even have things, we have this thing called Hive Mind, where normally you ask the presenter a question. Here you're going to ask the room a question, and then the room votes on which question is the best thing, and then the whole room answers it, and then the mentors kind of chime in on that. So it's a crowdsourced sort of crowd wisdom of the crowds kind of panel model. And we're trying new stuff out. And honestly, the reason is we tell startups to try new stuff out. We tell them, don't just phone it in, break new ground, take risks, experiment. We'd be hypocrites if we weren't doing that ourselves. And so we're really doubling down on, let's invest in technology, let's take some risks, and let's build something that gives people unexpected, remarkable experiences.
So quick thing. So Olivia, do you think that, as the pendulum swings very hard into the IRL as a reaction to the not IRL for the last couple of years with your analogs, like your literal analog pieces of paper and stuff like that, do you think that the pendulum will swing back to the center a little bit and we'll go back to something? Or like, are you building this thinking, no, this is the kind of the way it's going to be? Or are you like, it's all kind of flexible and you could see some old-fashioned stuff coming back? That's a poorly worded question. But
does this tech support another wave of COVID? I guess is what we're saying.
That or the novelty of paper will wear off in 1 year because it was cool because it wasn't last year. You know what I mean?
Well, isn't that the way digital was like years ago when everything became
What are you talking about, VR? What are you talking about?
Exactly. Like everything went from analog to digital and everything was innovative, and now kind of going back to analog, that's different. Like no one's ever, recently anyways, you won't receive a paper with matches on it. Everyone will just go in an app and look up matches there. So it's really that concept of like turning it on its head and basically going back to a way that we kind of maybe forgot about. And then to answer your question, basically, do I see it kind of going back into a neutral position potentially? Or we might just be like swinging back and forth. So next event might be super high tech or we might just keep it analog. It really, because we're testing all of this literally during those 3 days, we have no idea how it's going to play out. It might be so much fun because it might be so different. And so we might reproduce that at another event Or we might realize, okay, people just want to stick to digital and this is the way it is, and we might have to digitalify things.
Right. But going back to what Douglas was saying, it's like there's an intentionality here, which is like there's a feedback loop going year over year. So maybe this year is not digital, next year is digital, but the year after that might not be digital. You'll just like see what humans want and what's going on. Yeah.
So let's talk about that, because like I guess explicitly to state it here, like Startup Fest is now a tech company, and it was forced to, and now it's, I guess, choosing to. So
go to angellist.com/startupfest.
So I would want to learn a little bit, Olivia just made a great point about like, it's going to happen over 3 days, how you're measuring that, but then also how you're deploying it. You're a tech company now. What's your event tech stack? Because it sounds like you're building a lot of it.
So event tech stack would basically start with the website, I think. Like that's kind of where everything stems from. So I'm also rebuilding a little bit the whole backend internal system, of which the WhatsApp app and the Convo codes kind of stem from. So for that, we're using a headless CMS. So we're transitioning from WordPress, which we've used in the past. It's kind of become like a big behemoth of technical debt that cannot be solved in any capacity. So we're moving that whole system over to a more agile headless CMS situation. From there, we could build our websites way easier instead of having to spin up an instance for each year.
Oh, so you're turning it into a stack now rather than a bundle of Legos.
Well, I guess, yeah, in a way, but it just makes us way more adaptable to new things that come up. So when Alistair had the idea, or Alistair and Rebecca, I would say, when they had the idea of creating Convo codes, where we have to just spin up a list of questions specific to a topic, we built that within our CMS. So it's really just as simple as adding a new topic, and then a new web page would spin up, and there you go. We have a new web page with a bunch of topics that we'll just generate a QR code from. We really centered it all around that CMS and the websites, I would say. So the WhatsApp app, which we didn't really speak about, but that's basically what everyone will get, or what everyone will see once they scan the QR code at the back of their badge. So the WhatsApp application basically tells you what's going on at Startupfest. So what's up at Startupfest? You'll scan the QR code and you'll see on the webpage in real time what's going on. So if there's, mentor talks or there's pitches happening, you'll get that information on the back of your badge.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of naive to assume that people are going to read the schedule, then they're going to go to the conference. No, like we're always connected. And if anything, the pandemic made us realize, like, we always knew everyone had phones in their pocket, but why the hell would you have a schedule when you can just like point your phone at your badge and it says, hey, bonehead, if you're bored, there's 3 things happening right now. Like that's way more serendipitous, way more off the top.
We've through your app tracker, we noticed you're not moving that much. We think you should go get hydrated underneath the.
Absolutely. And I think the reality is, so we run this other conference called Forward 50. It's become the world's biggest digital government conference. There was a guy who runs Shared Services Canada, and Paul Glover, fantastic civil servant. He said that the government had a plan to deploy Microsoft Teams in 3 years. When the pandemic hit, it took him 6 weeks. 6 weeks from 3 years, right?
For
the
Teams.
Pandemic accelerated for Teams. The pandemic accelerated everything. And I personally don't think that an event company can survive if it doesn't become a tech company. We're in the business of, well, ask yourself, why do people go to conferences? Like if you wanted to just go sit in the park and drink, there's no need for an app for that. Just get a wagon and some beer, right? If you're going to provide value to people in the form of content, in the form of lasting connections, in the form of new ideas, in the form of conversations, in the form of the introductions to relationships that will take your business forward or help you achieve your goals, technology can help with that. And it's naive to think like, if you go to the library and pull out the Dewey Decimal System and start reading books to try and search for something instead of using Google, well, yeah, you could do that, but it's not a very efficient solution. It is naive for organizations to feel like they can buy floor space for 10 cents on the dollar and rent it out for $2 and they're just boring real estate companies with show floors. We think that that's doing a huge disservice to the attendees and the community, especially. I mean, we're Montreal proud. Like I have my Silicon Valley North crossed out Canada shirt. Thank you very much, BetaKit.
Thank you, sir.
I believe very strongly that we should lift up the Canadian tech community. That's something Startupfest has always done. First and foremost, it's the places, as you were saying, Doug, where like all of Canada comes together and we're like, yeah, let's go. And there's a sense of collaboration. We owe it to that community to build things that make us achieve those goals better. And I think, we're building this tech stack across all of our different properties. It's the same thing. But Rob, your question is a very valid one. Where does that pendulum settle down? Is it tech? Is it analog? I think the reality is it's a false dichotomy that tech enables the analog and the analog makes the tech more valuable. And we have to find the way for the technology to assist in the goals that every attendee has. And that's the system that Olivia's built.
So maybe to wrap it then, let's talk about, because one thing that we can get to is like measuring this, like how you're capturing data, but then also just like what is the success measurements? Well, like what are your KPIs? How do you evaluate? Not even where the pendulum is, if people are just like enjoying swinging back and forth on it every year, right? Noting here that this Startup Fest is going to be different in a lot of ways, but also because it's at a different location, which I think is, as much tech as you apply to this, if Startup Fest is going to be RRL, there are still things you have to plan out months and months and months in advance to put real humans in place. For our listeners, particularly those in Ontario who are like, can't wait to get on the startup train to go to Startup Fest. That is not happening this year. So if this is shocking news to you, I suggest
come on my train. I'm still taking the train, so come on my train.
The train still exists. There's just not a drinks car at the back of it where we're all hanging out at. But talk about how that's how you've scoped for the in-person part. Where it is, how the maybe the location history origin a little bit, but then how you're going to measure success in that environment.
So I'll talk a little to the location history, and then I'll let Olivia talk about the metrics we use, like what our golden rules are, and then how we're measuring those after the fact, while still not becoming so like dogged that we're tracking everybody. We're back at our original roots. In 2011, when we ran the first Startup Fest, we took over an old pier in Montreal's Old Port. We had a freight elevator that we turned into elevator pitches. We sat VCs down on a bench and asked them to channel their inner Simon Cowell and put up GoPros. It was hilarious. 84 startups stood in a line. We didn't know that. Every year we keep adding stuff. The grandmother judges who have this incredible investment record, better than any of the VCs. Like I wish there had been a syndicate for the grandmother.
They started as mother judges and now they're grandmothers.
It's really awkward because they're like the Senate or the Supreme Court. Like other grandmothers want to get in and we're like, until they retire or something else happens. But it's fantastic. And honestly, I love the fact that, we stack the deck. They're former business teachers and mainframe programmers and stuff. And they are just brutal. To this day, Guy Rosen, who is now like in the senior circle at Facebook in charge of internet policy, says one of the toughest meetings of his life was the Startup Fest grandmother judges when he was pitching Anava, which Facebook acquired. We're back to that original route. But in 10 years, the city of Montreal has made it over. It's now a very formal, like there was a Gaudi exhibit there. And it's a fantastically different place. But it's also very apropos because it's right on this pier. And one of the things I love about the fact that Startup Fest runs in the old port of Montreal is that half of all the trade from North America to Europe flowed out that port for hundreds of years. There's a reason that New Orleans and Quebec speak French and English because that's where all of the trade went, right? This is an amazing sort of epic location for this kind of event. And it's in the old port, which is just spectacular for summer parties. So it's kind of nice that after this, with the fresh start as our theme, we're returning to our roots, but those roots have been upgraded a lot. And then we're taking a fresh approach to this. We've had some of the best and most notable speakers in the world on startups. The inventor of DNS, the founder of Reddit, like all these incredible speakers we've flown jets of people in and had illustrious tech reporters and the inventor of the hashtag, all this kind of stuff. And
you guys, you don't have to promote us. We're going to be there. You don't have to oversell it to our audience.
I was leading up to that, Doug. But I think that the key is we got to keep reinventing ourselves. the community expects it of us. We have a reputation for being the people that came up with the elevator pitches and the grandmother judges and the fleets of boats. And so we're always asking ourselves, what can we do again? And it's only a team of 8 people. As you said, the challenge is to know whether it worked. And I'll hand things over to Olivia to talk a little bit about how we'll know whether it's going to work.
Yeah, what does that spreadsheet look like?
That's a little bit harder to create.
There's a worked checkbox, and it's like worked check.
Deployed.
That's a little bit harder to know. We do have some golden rules that are just kind of based on, did our algorithm work properly? And some of those rules are like, that the people who speak English, are they only match people who speak English? Or does every investor meet at least 1 startup? Or does every advisor meet at least 2 startups if they want to find clients and whatnot? So there are those kinds of rules that are a little bit more objective, because that's really something that I could evaluate once the matchmaking has been completed. But then there's a whole subjective component of it of, okay, even though person A had the same vertical as person B and they're in the same industry, same role, I cannot judge whether or not they're going to have a good conversation, because on paper, even if they match perfectly again in quotations, because there's never really a perfect match, but even if they're matched well on paper, there's nothing for me to know if in real life
the romance happened. Yeah,
exactly. They'll actually connect. So I will be walking around on site. So there's nothing better than just getting in there and listening to people talk and just kind of probing around and seeing how things are going. So I will be on site.
With a clipboard and a pencil.
So our listeners, yes, if you see someone with curly hair and glasses, a clipboard and pencil staring a little too closely at your conversation, it's part of the experience.
Drawing QR codes.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, so it's really just getting into the environment and seeing how people are connecting, and then potentially maybe asking a few of them, hey, did you meet that person because of the matchmaking, or was that just random? So really just getting up close and personal, I guess, with the attendees, and asking them face to face if that's someone that they met because of the algorithm. I think that's a good measure of success. There's really nothing better than that. Of course, there are ways that we're going to be using, such as like post-event surveys and, kind of talking with people at the connection desk, which is where they pick up their match cards. But everything is, again, going to be kind of more analog than the digital way that we're used to, where people just, answer surveys online or, have some analytics running in the background that you could like track their mouse clicks and whatnot. So yeah, we're gonna have to be as analog as the tech we're implementing. So we'll see. Again, this is a huge test, and if overall we get pretty good feedback from either the one-on-one conversations I have with people or from, let's say, the survey that we put at the end of the event, then we could say the matches happen relatively well. So there is an objective component and there is a subjective component, and unfortunately the subjective component is kind of going to be what we see on site. So
okay. Well, we look forward to hearing about how it goes, and then I guess we look forward also to seeing you in person to experience that as well. And then if we do a follow-up podcast either this time next year or maybe late in the fall, it's like, what we decided? Startupfest is just going to happen on a boat, or like everyone's going to be blindfolded. We're going to do a blind tasting menu thing, or like there's going to be a like.
Phil tried that. He was like he looked around. He started calling people to see if we could park barges and like have the party on the barges. There'd be like the startup barge and the accelerator barge, and all of a sudden you wind up having to talk to like the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and it gets complicated very quickly.
As someone who. Yeah, I'll tell this story. As someone who in 2019 brought his full team to Startupfest, which suffered from some fairly intense weather that year, being on the SVB boat party, thinking that I had sentenced my entire company to death, I'm glad you guys have steered away from the barge strategy, because...
Not all feedback is good feedback.
Yeah.
Olivia, just don't let the algorithm tell you what to do.
The BetaKit podcast is produced by BetaKit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.